Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm Sher Ali Khan. Thanks for tuning in. If this is your first time here, we'd love it if you like, subscribe, and shared this episode with friends, students, or anyone grappling with the mess of solidarity, politics, and aesthetic life. You can also support our work at buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Today I'm joined by Dr. Keya Ganguly, Professor of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Ganguly's work spans postcolonial theory, Marxist critique, film, and the contradictions of everyday life. Across these fields, she challenges how we perform our political commitments, especially in moments when clarity itself becomes suspicious. We'll be talking about her essay, The Stakes of Internationalism, which asks what happens when solidarity becomes not a relation, but a genre, a recognizable form emptied of demand, risk, or contradiction. And we'll also ask what kind of intellectual practice can still stay with contradiction when certainty feels so seductive. Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network, Kea. How are you doing?
Pretty well, given the world and under the circumstances.
No, it's an honor to have you on the show. I know we had been going back and forth over email, and something that stood with me over our email exchange was you wrote that the same political and epistemological questions have stayed with you since your early work, that we still live under the sign of capital, and that life has only gotten worse for many. Can you talk a little bit about your Marxist formation and what compelled you towards Marxism initially, and what sustains your commitment to it, even as its futures feel uncertain or compromised?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me and also for that question. If I have to think back to my formation, I think what I would say is that, unconsciously, I was motivated by so many moments in the history of the left front government in West Bengal, which is my home state, and which was the government in power. I mean, the party, the CPIM, was in power for a long time, the greater part of my growing up. And yet, it was a party that was riven with contradictions of class and of a certain kind of privilege mongering among the elites who were also part of the CPIM, and the large scale neglect or bypassing of kind of on the ground struggles of people. And ultimately, this is what led to the unthroning or dethroning of the left front government, and replaced by, I would say, a much more authoritarian populist party, that of Mamata Banerjee and her ilk. So part of my Marxist commitments derives from growing up in a culture in which many of the people that I was influenced by and listening to in conversations at home, some of the people I heard come to give talks at Delhi University when I was an undergraduate at Lady Shri Ram College, and then subsequently as a graduate student as well. Some of the most important ideas that I imbibed, I would say, were ones that I got in classes and graduate seminars by people like Fred Block. And then I discovered the Frankfurt School and really kind of immersed myself. I have been immersing myself insofar as it's possible to do that in a language that I don't know very well at all, which is German. So to read the Frankfurt School in translation, these are kind of key, I would say, signposts for my Marxist commitment. But the other thing that I would like to say is when I came of age in the academy, so to speak, and I speak as someone who's been an academic for almost 30, in the 70s and 80s, and then certainly more reinforced and entrenched by the 90s, there's a great deal of hostility to Marxist criticism, particularly in the West, in the American academy, especially, I would say. So, in a way, my kind of I took it on as a challenge and a kind of a commitment against the grain, to go against the grain of the disciplines in which Marxism had been easily dismissed, too easily, and in a kind of ignorant way as vulgar, or that Marxists needed to be reconstructed in order to be more supple and sophisticated. And any number of important critics issued these kinds of statements. So I was trying to figure out, well, is that really true? And you can't really figure that out unless you endorse something that makes sense to you as a kind of a axiomatic. And for me, that axiomatic is that in an age of identity, one of the lessons that Marx tells us that, but which we seldom pay attention to, is that class is not an identity. Class is a relation. And that led me to think about class in its relation to a number of different poles of fealty and filiation and affiliation. And that's, I would say, I don't know if that really answers your question as spiffily as you might have wished for, but that, in a sense, is why I became a Marxist, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great. I think like we'll be unpacking that a little bit more as the interview goes on. In your recent paper, I think from a year or two ago, titled The Stakes of Internationalism, it begins with a sense of epistemological saturation, a moment where solidarity is both everywhere and nowhere. What prompted you to write this article? Was there a specific political moment or intellectual tension that made the stakes of solidarity feel different or depleted in this current era that we're in?
Well, the first thing I need to say is that that particular piece was written as part of a roundtable on a book by a young friend and colleague, Oritra Majumdar, who's written a very important book called Insurgent Imaginations. And it really was an invitation that I took to focus in on that term internationalism, to figure out what it might have to offer, not as some kind of sanctified or sacralized principle from, the international movements, the first or the second international of the bygone century, but really to think about what that might offer both as an optic for critical work, but also as an optic for, or as a kind of a mode for organizing solidarities that might not exist otherwise or that have been diminished for various reasons. So that was
Yeah.
really the kind of warrant for writing that piece.
Yeah, I think that Rochana Majumdar's work quite directly in that piece, you engage with, particularly her emphasis on affect, intimacy, and leftist desire. And while appreciating her analysis, you seem wary of what happens when affective solidarity becomes genre. Could you speak about this tension between remembering past commitments and reproducing their aesthetic form and how it relates today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to respond to that, but I don't believe I have referred to Rochana Majumdar in that essay. So you might be thinking about either somebody else or some other
Oh,
venue.
sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
but
So, but in a way, I can answer the question without reference to her work because I don't really engage it. Um,
Mhm.
I don't engage it at all, although I think she's done important work on film history. I'm one of those people who is not swayed by the affective turn. I find that if you think about the kind of intellectual genesis of this turn to affect, more often than not, affect becomes a substitute for ideology. So instead of what seems like old fashioned ideology critique, people now are thinking about, or critics are now writing a lot about affect. And what that does is, first of all, bypass the problems that ideology critique presented. But that would have been okay if it actually produced something more substantive or weighty, which I don't believe it does, because what it does is render critique impossible. You're left in the position of either endorsing an affective response to something or simply calling it out by saying it is an affective response to something. There's no kind of epistemological ground for critique in that move. So I would say that that would be a kind of a more general way to address the question that you might have posed, but not in
Yeah.
relation to Majumdar's work.
Because I think in the article you cite Eritro Majumdar, Insurgent Imaginations, World Literature,
Yes,
and
yes.
yeah.
That
Sorry, I
article,
messed up.
yeah,
Yeah,
no, not Rochona, but Erythrom.
yeah,
The piece itself was a response, or rather, a kind of a invited critical response to his book. Now, his book, I think, does a lot of things very well, and I'm not quite sure exactly which specific statement of mine you're referring to, but I don't think that Orithro Majumdar is also too persuaded by the turn to affect. I mean, we've talked
yeah,
a lot about issues. I mean, I've known him since he was a graduate student at Syracuse,
yeah.
um, and I think that what he sees himself doing, which is something that I endorse a lot. I think it's right on the mark, is to look at what happens when you displace the kind of metropolitan emphasis on things like affect, on things like desire, on questions of subjectivity, and replace those kinds of fetishized concepts with concepts of labor, of contradiction, of exploitation, right? And that, I think, is what he's trying to do in the book, but in a literary way, looking at how literature can be a kind of a gateway into understanding what it means to be an exploited individual, or an exploited class, or an exploited, form of existence, to inhabit an exploited form of existence. It becomes less about identity and more about the kind of existential aspects of living in bad times, right? Living in a world that has not only is degraded, but is also degrading.
Yeah, no, this is very well put, and I really appreciate you saying that. This feels especially urgent in the current landscape where solidarity often comes as a public expression, a meme, a statement, a branded. What do you see as the limits of affective solidarity, especially when it becomes a script or a performance?
Right. I think that's a very important question. I think we have to rethink, or we have to probe what solidarity could mean now. As you say, I think rightly, when it simply becomes a kind of a slogan or a form of virtue signaling, then it's emptied of its content, right? But solidarities aren't something that are produced out of nothing, right? They have to have a concrete material basis. At least if you're working within a kind of a materialist or historical materialist framework, you have to posit that it comes from grounded struggles, and so it becomes less important to focus on the identity, again, of the agents doing the solidarizing, and more about the kind of work and the political stakes and the reasons, the goals for solidarity, that solidarity at least promises, forms of solidarity promise. So that's where I think the internationalist movement has something to offer us. Because if we go back and think about it, the Working Men's Association, this was a kind of a ragtag group of everybody from artisans to peasants to intellectuals to artists to students, um, migrants, who understood that their individual battles had to be, and individual struggles had to be placed under an umbrella. Otherwise, there would not be strength in numbers. So it was a kind of an alternative to either both the council communism that you find in places like Italy and in parts of Europe, and also a kind of a move that pushed against the impulses of anarchism,
Yeah,
right? So there's a kind
no,
of a
that is,
historical basis for for the internationalism that contemporary solidarity movements could look to.
yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also that risk that the genre of solidarity that the genre of solidarity evacuates the material contradictions of Marxist critique itself, and that comes through in that paper, and I think it's like really relevant for today. And could you elaborate a little bit more about the political stakes and how you view those political stakes? That instead of organizing around class, capital, and the state, we begin to curate our moral position and call it politics in a
Right.
sense.
Right. And that has very much to do with the turn in political theory towards ethics, where ethics comes in to replace politics as a kind of master metaphor, if you will. Um, and the stakes of internationalism, if that's the kind of terrain on which we're operating right now, suggest an entirely different way of thinking about politics, where, you're not issuing terms like collectivity or solidarity or, new social movements in the name of the identity of those movements, but rather not only what they have in common, which is to say their kind of identity and difference, if you will, but also what each of them sort of fails to account for, right? So there is a kind of a remainder to each of these ways of organizing, perhaps, that gets worked out in a practical political situation rather than abstractly, either as a theoretical move or as what you're calling a genre, right? A genre refers to something that um, focuses or emphasizes common elements while ignoring that which might not be assimilated or assimilable under the common features. But internationalism as a movement, reckons with that ambiguity or reckons with that maybe even an antinomy, an irreconcilable difference between things that are common, things that do share elements, and things that never will. Now, how much weight we give to that is not an abstract question. It's not something that we can, come up with a recipe for, but something that has to be worked out in practical political struggles.
No, I really appreciate that. I'm learning so much as we speak. I think recently two of the biggest solidarity movements, there have been so many of late, has been around like Palestine and India and Pakistan. We saw various left formations taking different positions, often rushing toward a declarative sort of solidarity where moral clarity, as you were explaining, is quickly claimed and circulated. At the same time, these expressions often operate at a distance from like material risk or contradiction. How do we stay committed to such struggles in ways that are meaningful without reducing solidarity to just like a projection of our own political virtue or turning it
Right.
into an aesthetic of resistance?
Right. I mean, I think you brought up a word that we really need to think more about, and that's risk. I was just reading yesterday that the class speaker for MIT, a young woman named Megha Vamuri, was prevented from not only giving her speech at commencement, but also disallowed from attending the commencement at MIT, where she is a brilliant young student. And
Absolutely.
a couple of people that I was exchanging notes on this about were, there were some people saying, well, she's just ruined her career. And others saying, well, she's very heroic and brave. I happen to be on the other side, which is to say that I think she's very heroic and brave. But the question that an example like
Yeah.
her really puts in our mind is, what kind of risks are people willing to take? What is the level of sacrifice, if you will, that is necessary to live out a political commitment, not just as an empty abstraction again or a pronouncement, but as an action, right? I mean, after all, she was only going to give a speech, and her culpability, such as it is in the eyes of the MIT brass, is that she signed a statement against the genocide in Palestine. And that was enough to ban her from giving the speech, even though MIT, of course, like every other institution, including my own, mouths empty pronouncements about freedom of speech and academic freedom and so on. But on the other side of the fence, it puts young people, old people, whoever, at enormous risk.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
risk is a category that we haven't really thought through, except in terms of large scale questions like the risk of climate change and so on and so forth. But the kind of existential risk and the suffering that various people avow, deliberately, self consciously as a political act, that I think is worth thinking a little bit more about. And it
Yeah, this.
is, it's never going to be something that we resolve. You can't reconcile yourself to risk, but you live with it.
Mhm. Yeah. So, building on that, some sectors of the left have increasingly adopted multipolar frameworks where critique of the US empire leads to uncritical alignment with other state powers like China or Russia under the banner of anti imperialism. At times, this seems to have been shaped by like a kind of Cold War nostalgia, a longing
Right.
for uh, a binary world where lines of solidarity and antagonism appeared clearer. Do you see this as another iteration of what you have called like solidarity as genre, where political clarity is claimed through like geopolitical
Mhm.
identification,
Right.
but contradiction and complicity remain unaddressed?
Right. I mean, we live in a unipolar world, right? So the US is now, sole arbiter of almost everybody's destinies by
Mhm.
fiat. And
Yeah.
that does lead to maybe some positions and um, affiliations that, in the long light of day might seem questionable. But, it always
Mhm.
comes down to some very basic kinds of questions that the US, of course, is the first to ask. It's that famous line from, who was it? John Foster Dulles, where he said, "You're either with us or against us."
Yeah.
And, you know, the contrasting line to that is, "My enemy's enemy is my friend." And so you can understand, at least as a move, why some people have gone overboard perhaps in endorsing Russia or the Chinese modes of marked politic, right? Exertion of power as against the US's. Because
Mhm.
frankly, right now, these are kind of hypothetical. I mean, the only power that is exerting itself, certainly you can hardly deny its oversized role in the Israel Palestine genocide. Well, there's no genocide on the Israeli side, but the Palestinian genocide, how that unipolarity takes shape. So, everyone is, I think, desperate for someone from somewhere to rise up and say, not this.
Mhm.
So I'm less inclined to castigate people for making those kinds of,
Mhm.
taking sides, if you will, just
Yeah,
because
of
the
course.
stakes, again, are so weighted on one side and so fragile and kind of disanchored on the other.
Yeah. In that article, you also you write that there's no political immunity in bearing witness. That line kind of cuts against a powerful fantasy in academia and social media that is simply seeing, naming, or testifying is itself like a political act, right?
Right.
And how did this idea of moral witnessing become so central, and what does it obscure in your mind?
Right. That's a very provocative question, really, Sher. Witnessing takes so many different forms, right? I mean, if you were a witness in the International Court of Justice,
Mhm.
that act of witnessing is much more substantive and significant than the kind of witnessing that happens when you are proposing to speak on behalf of XYZ others, right, who have suffered
Mhm.
and gone. There's a kind of a, not only, it's the opposite of guilt by association, it's heroism by association. You associate yourself with a moment of heroism, a moment of suffering, a moment of victory or defeat. And that increases your cachet, if you will. That's what I mean by the kind of virtue signaling that comes from affiliations of that sort. It's an empty gesture, right? But even more than that, it's often a cynical gesture. And I don't see any real purpose behind it other than maybe an opportunistic one. It might help someone's career, especially if it takes academic form, or it might it might give them a certain kind of prominence in what is, after all, a largely liberal framework of understanding in which we live, right? So radicalism is so marginalized that the most radical statements seem to be ones in which people are witnessing or testifying to someone else's issue.
Yeah,
In other words, there's very
absolutely.
little risk in witnessing of that sort.
Yeah. You also insist that solidarity must be able to hold contradiction and complicity, not disavow them. I found that also very interesting because, why has contradiction become so difficult to bear? And what does it do to political thinking when innocence becomes a prerequisite?
Right. I would try to answer it in two different ways. One is that it's not innocence that is the prerequisite, it's really ignorance, right? There's a kind of what Gayatri Spivak a long time ago called sanctioned ignorance that allows people to assume a position of authority and disavow how they came to that authority or what that authority might actually lead to, right? So that is one problem in front of us when we're thinking about the issue that you raise. And let me see if I can remember the second thing I was going to say in response. I'm a little tired of just avowing complicity, right? I mean, we live under capitalism. We're all complicit in some way or the other. I'm not directly complicit in the kinds of things that, let's say, Trump is doing, or that the big corporations are doing, or that the military industrial complex is perpetrating. But, insofar as I have a 401k at my university, and unless I'm very vigilant and think about these things, my retirement could depend on things like munitions futures and so on and so forth, right? Or just even finance capital. So complicity is not something that we avert or somehow find a way out of. You have to assume that it's there. And then the question is, what sort of reparative work is possible? What kinds of commitments are necessitated by recognizing that, those large scale contradictions as well as small scale ones, which have to do with one's own class identity or which have to do with questions of privilege. Those are not going away, but you can't just wallow in the idea that this gives you no space from which to maneuver, no room for taking a stand on issues that have nothing perhaps to do with you yourself. So in other words, let me give you an example. A lot of us write about novels, for instance, or films. In my case, there are many chapters in my book on Ray in which I'm talking about the way that a very privileged elite filmmaker like Satyajit Ray brings to the screen and brings to life the experience of extreme poverty in rural Bengal in ways that very few people have really managed to, let's say, imitate or really repeat. How? Is it his privilege that allowed him to make that kind of intervention? Or is it despite his privilege that he was able to make this intervention because he had a political vision, right? And the political vision did not come from a place of identity or of any kind of sense that this was his experience, which it wasn't, but from a deep commitment to bringing to light experiences that are not your own, right? That are not of oneself, that need to be told if one is going to have a progressive vision at all and not reproduce the kind of bourgeois aesthetic world.
Yeah, absolutely. You describe the ethical subject, someone who performs the right stance, feels the right emotion, signals the right alignment. How do institutions, especially the university and its circuits of recognition, reward this subject? And what does refusal look like in that context?
Universities in the US are like any other corporation. They're going to reward people and reward ideas that don't rock the boat fundamentally. And
Uh-huh.
they reward people who are, in a way, easily welcomed into that fold of privilege and of ideas that have ruled for decades, maybe much more than that. If you think about the gentleman scholar as a model of the
Uh-huh.
university intellectual, that is
Right.
not necessarily a model that works in the US. Although there were certainly gentlemen scholars in earlier generations, but certainly fewer and fewer now. But
Uh-huh.
nonetheless, there's a sense that, we belong. It's a club. And in order to be part of the club, you have to say the right things and you have to do the right things, which is to say, you don't want to critique the institution itself in a way that, bothers anyone. For the most part, humanists are just disregarded, right? We just do our thing. But now Trump has made the university itself a target. And so what you
Uh-huh.
say and how you say it and where you say it becomes very important. And
Uh-huh.
sensitivities have also emerged as a result of the culture wars on both sides,
Uh-huh.
the cancel culture on the one hand, and then the kind of right wing culture wars on the other, where people are trying to navigate, in between, sort of dance in between various sensitivities. That's what gets rewarded. To come out and say that, the university is a corrupt institution isn't necessarily the right thing to do either, because right now that is a sentiment that the right will run with. Right.
Yeah.
But so it's not necessarily the solution, but to recognize that the university is a corrupt institution and then try to see how that might change. This is, after all, a challenge of being in any kind of institutional setting, right?
Yeah. And in the context of like the digital sphere, we see a lot of younger organizers and intellectuals, me myself included, like we see outrage, various forms of statements being released, meme culture is another thing. Do you think this is like aestheticizing contradiction itself, turning it even into like turning even dissonance into sort of style,
Mhm.
expression
Right.
or something like that?
One's own actions and one's own words are not always able to capture their effects. There are always unintended consequences of anything one says or does, over which one has no control. And therefore, you have to, shy away a little bit from calling it culpable. I don't think it's so much culpability. I think people like you, younger people who are, you know, opening up a different world to audiences, perhaps even outside the academy, but also inside the academy. I decided a long time back that, in my classes, I might actually include a reading or two from the blogosphere, because that speaks to my students a lot more than, let's say, a kind of a classical author might. Or I try to compare what it is that is similar, what remains a kind of a shared theme in both arenas. So I wouldn't say that the digital sphere, so to speak, is just about aestheticizing dissonance. It's also about informing people in a way that was not possible outside of, much more circumscribed intellectual and institutional settings before. So that's the good side. On the other side, on the more negative side, yes, it's possible for anyone really to say anything, and there is no kind of necessary criterion of verifiability. So that, I think, is more the problem with the digital sphere, where misreadings, and I do believe that there are such things as misreadings or misunderstandings, can often be parlayed as correct positions or weighty judgments. So it's always a it's always in the instance, right? In the actual concrete example that you have to figure out, is this productive? Is this getting the conversation further down the road, or is it stymieing it? Is it stumping us? I think that is a challenge that actually the digital sphere also invites people to take on. Not everything I read is convincing, and therefore I should be a skeptic. That kind of intellectual skepticism, which used to be a hallmark of knowledge production maybe 30, 40 years ago, that kind of
Critique
intellectual
all that
skepticism,
exists.
yeah, it has disappeared really in a way. Intellectual skepticism, not questioning everything, like vaccine denial or something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But intellectual skepticism is what are the bases for a particular argument to hold. That kind of
yeah,
disappearance of skepticism intellectually is what has also led to, let's say, the giant size influence of Fox News. People believe what they hear.
yeah. You've also written about the missed encounter, of politics that doesn't resolve into harmony or recognition. Could this be a better figure for solidarity, not as an emotional identification, but as something demanding, incomplete, non-sovereign?
Yes, I think that's, I didn't realize I'd said it. It sounds really good. And I would go with that, which is that a politics that seeks to reconcile opposition or disagreement in the name of consensus is a dominative gesture, right? It's not a solidarizing gesture. Particularly in the US, where consensus has been the hallmark of many, many powerful movements, including feminism, right? Where consensus was what feminists often set out as the goal of a particular orientation that saw itself as feminist. But what if we were to not necessarily reach for consensus, but recognize that disagreement is itself valuable, that disagreement has a political value and maybe a longer shelf life than something that can just be agreed upon very quickly in the name of consensus or agreement.
Yeah. Uh, no, that's really well said. In your earlier work, States of Exception, you write, the everyday is not a moral refuge, nor is it neutral. It is the scene of saturation. That line feels central to the stakes of internationalism, too. How does your concept of everyday saturation reframe how we think about complicity, ethics, and solidarity, maybe?
Right. I mean, when I was writing that book, I was deeply influenced by Henri Lefebvre and his ideas about everyday life on the one hand. And I also wanted to be mindful of the kind of, what can I say, cautions that someone like Pierre Bourdieu offers to a field like anthropology or sociology. Cautions against validating the everyday simply as a terrain of truth or a terrain of experience that must be honored for its own sake. But experience is a very contradictory and contrary proposition, right? And I wanted to be mindful of the fact that when the people that were subjects of my first book, of the ethnography, the people that I studied and participated with and whom I engaged in that work, they were completely unself-conscious about what they were trying to do. And I'm not saying this to be condescending. It's the nature of experience that one doesn't necessarily think about it uh, unless you are put in the position of reflection. Right? I mean, this is why Hegel has his various stages in the phenomenology of mind, right? I mean, experience has to move from sense perception to understanding to knowledge. You don't just have it because you experience something. So rather than validating the everyday for its own sake, I was trying to get at those folds of experience that, on the one hand, blinded people to their own prejudices, and on the other hand, also revealed something about how they struggle um, as a diasporic community in the US, how they struggle with all of the practical daily conflicts that, at least in the East, was routine for South Asian immigrants to experience. Not that it's gone away, but now you have so many more prominent right-wing figures like Kash Patel or whatever, that South Asians have a certain kind of prominence in the public sphere, which will bring its own backlash as well, I'm sure. But at that moment, from the late 70s onwards, when the Johnson administration loosened immigration rules in this country, people came and were completely misrecognized and misunderstood. And so I was trying to get at what accounts for those misunderstandings and how do people manage and navigate that, negotiate that in their own daily lives.
You
Was there,
also
I'm not
write
sure
that,
there's, yeah,
sorry,
there was a question
sorry.
there, but I'm not sure I answered it.
I was just asking about everyday saturation and how that
Mhm.
reframes how we look at concepts such as complicity, ethics, or solidarity, and the significance of that work.
It's such uneven terrain, right? The everyday is such uneven terrain. People live at multiple levels, right? I mean, even in a very ordinary life, there are many different competing demands that could be folded into the category of one's everyday existence. And
Yeah,
how, in aspects of that, one might be complicit. In other aspects of it, one might be resistant, right, to the forms of power and authority that are constantly interpolating people into a particular understanding of what life should be, a normative understanding of what life should be. So the everyday becomes a kind of a wedge, in that production of normalcy and production of reified existence. And some people are much more attuned to the fact that they're constantly under a certain kind of assault, and other people are much more unself conscious about it. And in that book, I was trying to figure out what accounts for some forms of self consciousness and reflexivity that one could detect or sort of discern in everyday experience. On the other hand, what accounts for the kinds of closure or blind spots that equally inform and maybe even overwhelm our understanding of everyday life. But really, what I was trying to do in that book was contest the notion that there is such a thing as postcolonial identity in the singular. Now, obviously, that might seem kind of banal now, but to me at that point, it was important to try to disentangle because everyone was writing about postcolonial identity as though it was something that you could put your finger on. And my interest was in interrogating that very notion that there was such a thing as postcolonial identity. And I looked to the everyday to figure that out, to kind of symptomatize or diagnose that.
yeah. And in that book, you also talk about how the everyday is shaped by repetition and crisis. But
Hmm.
repetition is often pathologized, right? It's like seen as this inertia, there's like apathy. But my question, I suppose, is that what kind of political attention does repetition demand from us, especially in a moment when we're always looking for ruptures? And those are the things that the spectacular event or like rupture is always romanticized.
Hmm. Right. When you are basically a worker under capital, it doesn't really matter. I mean, unless you're a kind of CEO or something. If you're a worker under capital at any level, you're involved in grunt work, in drudgery, right? And this is especially true of people who are, who were the folks that I was dealing with studying in that book. They're engineers or doctors or, you know, secretaries and a few lawyers, not that many. This was kind of the bulk of the subjects that I was dealing with in that book. And their lives are still, I would say, all our lives are comprised of, repetition, where there are just tasks that you have to get done. There are meetings one has to attend, right? There's a kind of a pattern of the everyday that becomes habitual and, in a sense, numbing. And I wanted to get at what are the kinds of flashpoints that make that, numbed existence kind of fall apart? What are the sort of trouble spots in that patterning of everyday life? The comfort that it brings, but also the unself consciousness that is required of some very, very smart people. And of course, they couldn't be unself conscious or completely unself conscious. So they resorted to, and I think you recognize this as a a strategy that we all employ. I listen to old Hindi music when I'm feeling that, I need to get out of this country and get away from, you know,
Yeah.
uh, everything that surrounds me. Or I will, resort to listening to or even singing Rabindra Sangeet, so Tagore music. So
Marx used to read Shakespeare.
exactly. So, and Goethe. So, there are strategies that we all employ. And that is to me, a very key moment to recognize that people don't just live unself consciously, but that they also recognize those moments when the patterning, the routinization, the habitual needs to be disrupted or is disrupted by either consciously or unwittingly by people. It's a moment of both um, illumination. It's what Walter Benjamin once called profane illumination, right? It's
Mhm.
not the illumination of kind of a religious insight or epiphany, but an illumination that is produced by one's keen sensitivity or understanding of exactly how bad life is.
I really appreciated you. I appreciate how you explained that. Something that was also in the book, which I think was urgent across your work in general, is the idea of non sovereignty, that political subjects are not the masters of their own circumstances, but they remain entangled, unfinished, or even incoherent.
Yeah.
And I was sort of wondering, how does this challenge frameworks that demand clarity from solidarity or otherwise?
Well, agency has become such a big word, right, in contemporary discourse and even contemporary political struggles. We're constantly finding agents here, there, and everywhere. But agency is a very complicated matter, and it's a very fraught and vexed matter. More often than not, people don't see themselves as agents. And to attribute agency to people who have none is, I think, a move in bad faith. And perhaps the term that has been most abused is the term subaltern or subalternity, where, subalterns are mysteriously seen to have the kind of agency, which if they had, they would not be subalterns. So it's a kind of a logical impossibility, a logical contradiction. But it helps, it again it romanticizes the subaltern by assigning to them an agency, a historical agency that they may or may not have had, more likely didn't. Uh, so once you ride that bandwagon of finding agents everywhere, historical agents everywhere, you are kind of already, I would say, destined to
Yeah.
get to a place where
Yeah,
incompleteness.
you write that the subject of the everyday is not the agent of history, but its
Right,
remainder, I think, in that book.
right,
And
right,
that remainder part is kind of interesting when you think about some of the work that other critical scholars have done, who have talked about the body or like endurance, say like Paganelli or these sort of scholars. And you're
mhm,
coming at it from a different set of theoretical apparatus. And I found that very fascinating to read, coming from a Marxist intellectual who isn't over determining different ideas of
right.
the state and, looking at how these things work in the everyday. And I think that's very relevant today. So I want to conclude the interview by returning to like the moment we're in right now. How might one stay committed to Palestine or these questions of abolition, decolonization, while refusing to perform innocence and without retreating into the irony or inaction? And I have another question, just like where is your work leading to, and are you working on any current projects? What are those
Right.
questions intellectually and then on that level?
I would say that when it comes to Palestine, I've learned the most from the students who have organized the protests and been at the forefront. I don't think it's us, meaning professors or faculty who can claim any particular role of leadership. I think the students have taught us how solidarity happens. If you just look at the portrait. I don't know, I can't remember offhand the name of the documentary that was done on the Columbia student protest movement. I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about. Do you remember the title of that film?
Oh no, I forgot the title, but I know what you're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah. So, how important it was to see people who have adopted this particular crusade of trying to get attention to the genocide that is ongoing now, but also the history of Palestinian dispossession and all of the risks that they've taken, including by getting their visas revoked, their degrees not given, imprisoned, deported, so on. These are huge risks that people are taking on a daily basis. I'm moved and inspired by that. But
Yeah,
what it means is that for me, it just simply means that you have to understand suffering, that suffering is a universal thing. It doesn't belong. It there's no, what was it that Camus once said? There is no algebra of blood. It's not that we can get involved in calculations about whose people shed more blood.
yeah,
And if you do that, then again you fall into the kind of chosen people syndrome. And
mhm,
I think that's catastrophic. So, what inspires me about the student movements is precisely that there is no kind of a calculus of priorities. It's just a very universal kind of statement of solidarity with people who are being killed and, whose lives are being destroyed, whose homes have been demolished, and so on, without necessarily feeling any personal, implication in that.
yeah,
That's a very concrete example of how solidarity can work and has worked and is working. And that's why it's so dangerous to power. It's
yeah,
not for nothing that this particular set of student protests have become such a nightmare for institutions. Of course, they're returning it with their own nightmares that they're imposing on people. But I think that gives me hope for what
yeah,
is perhaps possible down the road, although obviously there's a lot more bloodshed that evidently is going to happen before we get to the other side.
yeah. And just a final question about your intellectual pursuits, upcoming
Right,
works,
yes.
things that you're working on currently, any anything
Right.
of that
Right
nature.
now I'm trying to finish a book on the early 20th century revolutionary and leader of the Indian nationalist movement, Aurobindo Ghosh. So Aurobindo, of course, becomes subsequently a rishi and, moves to Pondicherry and becomes a kind of a mystic and a sage and, you know, a yogi. I'm not interested so much in that part of his life because I don't really know that much about. I couldn't take a stand on. I wouldn't be able to explicate his philosophies of yoga and so on. But I
Mhm.
am interested in the reasons why he has been subordinated, if you will, in the narrative of Indian nationalism by figures like Nehru and Gandhi.
Can you tell a little bit about him as a figure and what his significance was and those things?
So before he came on to the scene, I mean, it's a very curious and very interesting story of a highly anglicized elite man born into a family. His father was a doctor in the imperial government and the imperial services. And when he was born, his father was the model, the kind of Macaulay model of the hunting, fishing, shooting kind of Indian gentleman, right? So he was sent off at the age of 7 to live in England. And he went to public school there. He went to Cambridge. And there he was politicized. He was already politicized a little bit before then, it appears, but really his kind of awakening, if you will, happened when he was a student at Cambridge. And his father's dream for him was that he would become an ICS, an Indian civil servant, Indian civil
Yeah.
service officer. So he sat for the exam. He did very well, but failed to show up for the riding requirement because at that point ICS officers had to be able to demonstrate their riding capacities because I guess you had to ride
Yeah.
around in the districts
Yeah.
to make sure that everything was copacetic or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
But by this time, he also didn't want to be part of the ICS because he saw it just as a kind of a being a kind of a toady to the imperial government. And he returned to India and became a kind of a first a professor, but also the secretary to the Gaikwad, the Maharaja of Baroda, and subsequently moved back to Calcutta. Now, keep in mind, this is a man who didn't even know any Bengali. He didn't speak it very well, and he certainly couldn't read or write it. His
Mhm.
father had banned the speaking of Bengali at home. So, how does a person like this become the kind of galvanizing force for the anti colonial movement? That's a very interesting question that I'm trying to explore. The other is that before he came on the scene, it's not that there were no anti colonial disruptions or mobilizations, there were. But it's the moment that gives us the shift from anti colonial agitation to the nationalist movement. So the organization of anti colonial struggle into a nationalist political movement, that's something that everybody attributes to him, although it's something that has not become not really so prominent anymore in the story of Indian nationalist historiography. So I'm trying to write about that because I find it fascinating.
That is really fascinating. I look forward to your work coming out, and thank you for this rich and dense conversation. You've given us not just a critique, but an invitation to refuse the comforts of clarity and to remain within a world even when it refuses us back. If you found value in this episode, please share it, subscribe, and support our work at buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Again,
I'll
thank
be
you.
sure to support your work as well. Thank you again for having me. And I
Yeah.
appreciate the invitation. I hope that the conversation generates some discussion and also moments of provocation, perhaps. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is Sher Ali Khan, and you've been listening to Organic Filaments Network. Until next time, goodbye.
Khuda Hafiz.
Okay. Khudafis.